How do I read the book of 1 Timothy? All of the letters we've looked at so far were written by Paul to churches, but here we now see a shift to more personal letters written to individuals, but just as important as the others despite their more personal nature. This letter is to someone who was very close to Paul and who was involved with a lot of the letters we've already looked at. Who wrote this letter? Well, it's the Apostle Paul again. He identifies himself right at the start. Some have questioned if it was Paul for a few reasons, all of which are easy enough to answer. One is that it's stylistically quite different, the content and the vocabulary. Some of his attitudes towards things, for example, moderation in all things, doesn't sound quite like the Paul of some previous letters. And lastly, the context doesn't seem to fit with the last years of Paul's life as described in Acts. These differences are easy to explain. First, these letters come much later in Paul's life than many of the others. Any writer changes their style over time, and of course many of his earlier letters were written with other people, such as Timothy, who obviously doesn't have a hand in this one. We must also consider that when you write a letter to a group of people or a church, you will speak differently than you would to an old friend. Secondly, he is writing in a different context. The earlier battles of the church were different ones now. Paul didn't need to argue the points he did in earlier years. And thirdly, the book of Acts doesn't include the last years of Paul's life. It ended with Paul under house arrest in Rome, but a lot happened after that when he was released, as we can see in some of his letters. Paul continued his ministry before getting arrested again. In the last few months of his life, Paul writes to his younger friends to help them in churches they've been sent to. This is one of those letters. This letter is written to not a church this time, but a person. This is to Timothy, who we have heard much about in previous videos. He was Paul's travelling companion and co-worker. He was now leading the church in Ephesus and was having challenges that Paul wants to address and help him with. When was it written? It was approximately in AD 63, right near the end of Paul's life when he was back in chains in Rome. Before we go into details, how could we describe this book in one sentence? Pastors, church leaders, and church members are taught how to conduct their lives. Why did he write it, and how can we understand this book? Handily, Paul tells us why he is writing this letter. He says in 1 Timothy 3 verses 14 and 15, "I hope to come to you soon, but I am writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth." And that's a good way to sum it up. He is writing to show Timothy how one should behave in church. This letter, along with the 2 to Timothy and 1 to Titus, are known as the pastoral epistles, or the pastoral letters, a term that was added in 1703. But that might be a bit misleading and make you think they are just for pastors and leaders. They are no more pastoral than the other letters of Paul, who was guiding the churches he writes to, and they were often dealing with pastoral issues. A better term might be the friendship leaders, because Paul is writing to friends of his and giving practical advice in the running of their churches. Paul is close to the end and he knows it. So he has given insights and direction from his experience to a new generation of church leaders. A lot of Paul's letters are theological, but here he gets practical. This means this letter gives us a little glimpse into how church life looked in the church at the time towards the end of Paul's life. The church in Ephesus was becoming a mess, partly because the wrong leaders were in place, Timothy had the task of selecting a new team of leaders, and Paul wants to help him with that. You can break this letter down into 3 main sections. A warning against legalism and false teaching in chapter 1, the qualification for leaders in chapter 3, and the behaviour of a good minister in chapters 4, 5 and 6. In Ephesus there was opposition to Paul's teaching that came from the Jewish legalists, something that often followed Paul. And Paul encouraged Timothy to stand against it. The endless genealogies, speculation, and what Paul calls vain discussion. He talks about the place of the law, that it's to show us where we are going wrong, so that people who are lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. This was not meant to be an all-inclusive list, which is why it ends with, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. So that people may know these things are wrong. Paul isn't condemning people who practice these things, so to speak. He even refers to his own past as a former blasphemer, persecutor, and insolent opponent, but to point out that the law shows where sin is, and that sinners can find hope and freedom in the gospel of Jesus. Knowing what sin is shows us our need for Jesus and leads us towards salvation. He then encourages Timothy to stand strong against the false teaching that undercuts this. He then talks about leadership, speaking into the practical situation Timothy was dealing with. He looks at what's required of someone in leadership, both elders and deacons. Many of these things are similar, and most of them, apart from the requirement that an elder be able to teach, are character-based rather than skill-based. Often when we look for leaders, we first look at skills. But Paul is clear here. Character trumps gifting. A skilled man can be the wrong man if his character does not measure up. Paul then, in the last section, hones in on this idea of character and good behaviour, and how ministers, but actually also how all of us in church should live. Bodily training, Paul says, is of some value. Living a godly life has eternal value. He talks about conduct in church, how different generations can relate to each other, providing for your family, looking after widows, ensuring those who lead the church are paid well. He actually uses the term double honour for this. How to respond to accusations against church leaders and so on. It's all very practical and helpful to show how church community should operate. Although this book is written to a church leader, showing us how to behave in the house of God can speak to the rest of us too. It shows how, if the church is to prosper, those who lead it and are part of it must seek good character and hold fast to the truth of the gospel. And it's a lesson for us all. Skill is not enough. Character is even more vital. So let us learn from this and seek to develop godly character in every area of our lives.